Hey, how's everyone doing? We're happy to have you all from all over the world. If you're new here, welcome to the family. Don't forget to like and subscribe. You won't believe these numbers, but they're true. Thousands of tanks, gold, hundreds of planes destroyed. Nearly 1 million Russian soldiers dead, wounded or missing. This isn't a war anymore, it's a collapse. And the man responsible for all of it, Vladimir Putin, what started as a military campaign has turned into a meat grinder, not only grinding up equipment, but also the myth of Russian power. Russia is running out of troops, running out of weapons, and running out of time. Let's break down the numbers that prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that Russia is finished.
On April 29th, Kiev Independent published an in-depth report on the massive human losses Russia has suffered since Putin launched his invasion in February 2022. These losses are staggering. In just over 3 years of war, Russia has lost an astonishing 950,860 soldiers, either killed, wounded, or captured. That's nearly 317,000 soldiers a year in a war that has been a horrific meat grinder ever since the initial shock invasion ended. And it's only getting worse for Russia.
In addition to these massive troop losses, which are the largest Russia has seen in a single conflict since World War II, Putin's faltering invasion has led to a huge depletion of the country's military equipment. Right now, 10,728 Russian tanks are destroyed on the Ukrainian battlefield. Most of these tanks are old Soviet-era models. Before the war, Russia was believed to have around 3,300 operational tanks. Nearly all of those have been wiped out. The additional 7,000 tanks lost since then were much older models that had been frozen in storage for decades. Russia has burned through those tanks to the point where only remnants remain. The story is the same no matter where you look. Over 22,300 Russian armored vehicles have been destroyed in Ukraine. Putin has lost another 46,432 vehicles and fuel tanks, along with more than 27,000 artillery systems and 1,373 Russian multiple rocket launchers. Ukraine has destroyed 1,146 Russian air defense systems, opening the skies for its drones and other air assets, and wiped out 370 Russian fighter jets and 335 helicopters since February 2022. The once feared Black Sea Fleet is in chaos. This fleet, once seen as key to Putin's strategy in southern and eastern Ukraine, has lost 28 ships and 1 submarine. It's also unable to replenish its naval assets. Just weeks after Putin's invasion, Turkey passed an international law preventing warships from any nation from sailing into the Black Sea. Turkey is the guardian of these waters, controlling the Bosporus and Dardanelles Straits that link the Black Sea to the Aegean and Mediterranean seas. Turkey made those routes off-limits to Russian warships. As a result, the Black Sea Fleet is collapsing. Even with drones, Russia is struggling. Putin has relied on drones to support his missile and bombing campaigns in Ukraine. The result? Ukraine has destroyed 34,177 drones, showing that even when Russia innovates and changes tactics, it's still suffering huge losses. Don't underestimate how much these losses are affecting Putin's efforts in Ukraine. Every soldier or piece of equipment lost weakens the Russian army. And with this weakness, the ability to launch ground attacks, which Putin has relied on since his invasion, turned into a war of attrition, is dwindling. Weaker Russian forces can't attack with force. They're also easier for Ukraine to push back, which is one reason we're seeing these huge numbers today.
If you need any more proof of these facts, just look at 2 things. How much Russia had to sacrifice to seize the land it took from Ukraine in 2024, and what that means for Putin's struggling efforts to grab more land so far in 2025. On May 5th, the BBC published an interesting report. The report claimed that 45,287 Russians were killed in 2024. These numbers are low, especially when compared to those published by Kiev Independent just a few days ago. There's a good reason for that. The BBC uses confirmed death tolls, while Kiev Independent shares numbers based on Ukrainian reports of Russian losses. According to Ukraine, the actual number was closer to 430,000 Russian casualties in 2024, although they don't specify how many of those were killed versus captured or wounded. Even the BBC is aware of this. The discrepancy pointing out that the number of deaths may only cover between 45% and 65% of the actual Russian deaths that occurred in Ukraine reveals something interesting about the rates of Russian territorial gains in Ukraine and the losses Russia suffers to capture that land. The BBC claims that its conservative numbers mean that Russia lost 27 of its soldiers for every square kilometer of Ukraine it was able to capture in 2024. That equals 27 deaths for every 0.38 square miles. These losses included more than 3,400 Russian airborne troops, 1,400 Marines, over 600 Special Forces soldiers, and 132 Federal Security Service (FSB) operatives. This means a huge loss of specialists for relatively small territorial gains. If we add Ukraine's 2024 casualty figures to these territorial gains, the picture becomes even worse for Putin. Comparing Ukraine's reported losses of 430,000 dead to the BBC's reported 45,287 deaths, we get a ratio of 9.49 dead for every BBC reported death. Multiply that by the 27 deaths the BBC mentioned for every 0.38 square miles Russia gained in 2024, and you get about 256 Russians who lost their lives, were wounded, or were captured for every 0.38 square miles Putin took in Ukraine in 2024. Once again, the numbers don't lie. Putin has exhausted vast amounts of manpower from his army, along with many of his most experienced and skilled soldiers, to gain control of about 20% of Ukraine by the end of 2024. This is simply unsustainable. But we'll get into that shortly. This huge weakness in the Russian army from a manpower perspective has had clear effects on Putin's campaign. 2025 has been a very bad year for Russia so far in terms of territorial gains. In April, Al Jazeera published two reports, one from the Institute for the Study of War and the other from the British Ministry of Defence. Both show that Russian territorial gains have slowed dramatically in 2025. The Institute for the Study of War's figures are a bit more favorable to Putin. They say Russia managed to capture 165 square miles of Ukraine in January, with the number dropping to 137 square miles in February and hitting its lowest point at 78 square miles in March. In other words, Russia's territorial gains dropped by more than half over the first 3 months of 2025. The British Ministry of Defence's numbers are even more damning. They say that Russia only seized 126 square miles of Ukraine in January, followed by 76 square miles in February, already lower than the Institute for the Study of War's numbers for March, and just 55 square miles in March. April wasn't much better, according to Euromaidan Press. The agency says Russia seized 68 square miles of Ukraine in that month, putting it right in line with the Institute for the Study of Wars and the British Ministry of Defence's figures for March. In other words, there was no improvement. But there are still huge losses. What we're seeing here is that the transition from winter to spring didn't mean much for Putin's forces. When they should have been ramping up the intensity of their attacks, they actually became so weak that they're now capturing less land each month than at almost any point during the invasion. All of this ties back to the massive Russian losses we shared earlier. Frankly, it all makes a lot of sense. With over 950,000 Russian soldiers lost, including large numbers of veterans and military specialists, Russia's attacks in 2025 have become so weak that Putin can do little more than throw soldiers at Ukraine's defenses in the hope of breaking through. These soldiers are much weaker than those Putin had in 2022. They're poorly trained and often conscripts or contract soldiers who don't want to be in Ukraine. Add to that the deteriorating state of Russia's equipment, and you have a situation where Putin is draining his army daily. All of this leads to one thing: a terrible rest of 2025 for Russia. Why? We have bigger numbers. On May 3rd, Euromaidan Press published Russia's casualty rate for the first 4 months of 2025. It's huge. larger than what we saw in 2024. The paper says that so far Russia has lost 160,000 soldiers, either dead, wounded, or captured during the year. Multiply this figure for the first third of 2025 by 3, and you get a projected loss rate of 480,000, which is 50,000 more than in 2024. Once again, we see proof of the Russian army's depletion. Putin's strategy of attrition was supposed to drain Ukraine's numbers, not his own. Let's do more calculations. If we use the Institute for the Study of War's more conservative numbers on territorial gains for the first 3 months of 2025, we get 380 square miles. Add to that Euromaiden's 68 square miles for April, and you get a total of 448 square miles at the cost of from 160,000 soldiers. That equals 357 soldiers lost for every square mile of land gained, which is even higher than the number of soldiers lost per mile reported by the BBC for 2024. If we extend these numbers to cover the rest of 2025, Russia will have captured only about 1,140 square miles of Ukraine for its highest annual losses so far in the war. This is simply unsustainable. According to Ukraine's official site, Putin's goal is 233,030 square miles. By the end of 2024, Russia had captured around 20% of Ukrainian land, meaning about 46,606 square miles of Ukraine were under Russian occupation. That leaves 186,424 square miles at the start of 2025. If Russia is on track to capture only 1,140 square miles in 2025, it would take Russian forces another 163 years to completely occupy Ukraine at their current rate of progress. Of course, there are caveats to these numbers. If Russia manages to capture Kyiv, it's likely the rest of Ukraine would fall as well. Putin might also escalate attacks later in the year, as he did in the final months of 2024, leading to more territorial gains, though likely at the cost of more soldiers and equipment. However, over a century of war for a special military operation that was supposed to last 5 days, Russia is essentially done even if they win in Ukraine. The sheer scale of their losses during this time would leave the country a mere shell of its former self. The same applies to Ukraine, of course, but Russia's weakness due to Putin's disastrous approach to this war will make it irrelevant on the geopolitical stage. If the country doesn't collapse in on itself, it will be an easy target for the likes of China to manipulate. And it won't pose any significant threat as an enemy to the United States once the war in Ukraine is over. That said, maybe it's not as bad as it seems for Russia. Maybe Putin will suddenly evolve into some form of tactical genius and find a way to start making gains again with fewer losses. If that's the case, he'll need to do it fast. Russia's daily loss figures still look terrible, showing us that despite all these losses so far, it's clear Putin has no backup plan.
Going back to April 27th, we see a troubling pattern emerge for Russia. On that date, the country lost 1,030 soldiers, along with 8 tanks, to Ukraine's steadfast defense. That 24-hour period also saw the destruction of 42 Russian artillery systems. These daily numbers are bad, but they were about to get worse. On May 3rd, Russian losses rose to 1,170 in one day. The country also lost 6 more artillery systems than it had on April 26th. However, there was something for Putin to smile about. Russia only lost 4 tanks on May 2nd, compared to 8. Moving on to the next day, the numbers kept worsening. 1,340 soldiers, either dead or wounded. 11 tanks lost, along with 2 fighter jets shot down by drones armed with American AIM-9M missiles over the Black Sea. Maybe you're starting to realize why Russia's overall losses are so massive? You may also start seeing a clear pattern. Russia's daily losses, spanning the end of April and early May, are happening at a time when Putin's forces are capturing less and less land for those losses. All of this is fuel for the fire of Russia's downfall. Additionally, these daily losses show that Putin has run out of ideas. He can't stop the tide. Thousands of Russians will be killed before the end of 2025. However, there is a silver lining for Russia.
They finally managed to drive Ukrainian forces out of Kursk. In August 2024, Ukraine launched a bold counteroffensive in Kursk, with their forces taking large amounts of Russian territory. This was a huge move at the time. By taking part of Kursk, Ukraine gave itself leverage for future peace talks. It also delivered a huge lesson and humiliation to Putin by showing him that his forces were no longer safe on their own soil. Then, on April 27th, Russia claimed it had finally wiped Ukraine out of Kursk. A senior military leader stated that this date marked the last village previously under Ukrainian control being retaken. Putin praised his soldiers and the bravery of the North Korean forces that Russia had recruited to help reclaim Kursk. By the way,